Well, I'm John. Uh, that's Jamie, and we are two pastors very patiently to very impatiently going through this book called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. And our conversation is going like this.
Yep.
This time today, we have both agreed that we've actually read a portion of the chapter that we're in, which is a good start.
Hmm.
The portion is on worship, which is chapter 7. Um, so I told you I read about half of this chapter. Like, where I'm curious, where did you stop?
I skimmed through the end, but probably the place where I got most slowed down was the section on the sermon. I went past
Okay,
it because he spent so much time on that section, and
yeah,
then after that, I kind of skimmed.
okay, yeah, I stopped. So that's good.
Yep.
Like as a man, like that just we talked about this before. The Probably the evangelical mindset model is sermon
Oh yeah.
as as the most important thing.
Hmm.
I would like I would debate that.
Hmm.
But as we said when we talked about this, whenever that was, like I mean, honestly, it is the thing that we devote the most time to. So I could easily be swayed in the argumentation of, yeah, it probably is the most important thing, at least by time wise. So great. So I stopped in the same exact spot.
Sure.
Um, so what? So we're in chapter 7 of this thing, and um, what? I guess what were some things like going through this? I made some arrows, um, some additional highlights, and all that kind of thing. As you were kind of reading through this, like what were some things that you really wanted to make sure we spent some time on today?
It's always it's interesting when you're, from an Orthodox perspective, and you read this, and it's interesting to hear, kind of to try to see um, which the early church, again, it's sort of a term. It's not, I'm not against that term, but it's a funny term in some ways to me. But what the nascent beginning church, when you see this stuff as an Orthodox Christian, like so much of this resonates because like, oh yeah, okay, we do that, and we do this, and we do this, and these things are still existent. I think probably the character. I mean, worship for the Orthodox Christian. This is where, like, when we talk about the sermon and things like this, worship, we believe how we worship. Like, it's sort of like you can't. Well, let me backtrack. I've not been a part of Protestantism or evangelicalism for 20 years. So, I probably know less now of what's really going on. But certainly when I was in that world, and I think it's important to realize like how this is such a different world in Orthodoxy. I mean, there are similarities, but there are just wide swaths of where Orthodox people who don't, they'll assume there are similarities that aren't there at all. And I have to tell them, like, this is very, very different. You have to realize this. Then also, too, when we come into this and we look back, it's like, wow, this is very, very different. But like worship for the Ortho, and I think this should be true. This should be true for all Christians. The worship of God is the foundation and also the structure of all that we do as a Christian.
Yeah.
Worship, we would look at worship as a thing that teaches us how to believe. Specifically, it's not, what I grew up with when we would think about worship, typically it was, on Sunday particularly, you come in to church and the capital W worship, as you might know, would be the hymnography that we would sing.
Yeah.
Probably you would include in that anything musical if it was a special piece of music or something. Which these days I don't know how that's done so much. I know now we're more geared on what we used to call like praise teams, but then now it's not really it. It's just, it's the worship team. And in a sense, in an Orthodox church, you have a worship team. It's called the choir and the priest and the deacons and all the people doing these things. And you have the laity gathered around. But we had those things, and then the sermon was usually thought. Of course, it was the thing that was. And again, it's kind of funny in here because I'm starting to read the sermon section, and I keep flipping pages. I'm like, what he spent like 5 minutes on this thing, and he's spending like 30 minutes on this over here. It's so interesting, the kind of the mentality and how actually. The author, it's very interesting. I'm gonna jump right ahead to that. I kind of laughed when I read it. Where is it at? He said, and it really echoes both positively and negatively. It's first line on page 194. The Christians of the early centuries gave surprisingly little attention to the sermon. So it kind of cracks me up in a way.
Hmm.
The sermon in, I mean, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but the sermon in the Orthodox Church, I was at a church on Sunday when I was up for my friend's funeral, and at her home parish, her priest, it's a long service. We'd already been at church for probably at the time the sermon happened for probably an hour and a half already. So we served a morning service, which actually in here would be called the evening service, called Orthros or Matins. And then the Divine Liturgy began, and then he preached a sermon, 5 minutes long. And my wife turned to me because I was going to serve with him, but I asked if I could just sit and be a part of the worshipers. And she turned to me, she said, "Is that it?" But interestingly enough, at the end of the service, then he also had some more things to say. And there's other places where the priest will say stuff, but the service itself is intended throughout to be teaching. So it's both, the whole idea of this was that the weight of what is put on the sermon, I think, typically in Protestant or evangelical circles, tends to be more heavily distributed throughout the service, which is not to say you don't have priests who will preach for a very long time, and place great emphasis on the sermon. So it's not universal, but it did kind of crack me up because, for us, it's all of a piece. We read the gospel passage first, then the priest usually will talk about what we've heard in a homily or sermon or some instructive word or whatever you want to call it, either right in the middle of the divine liturgy or at the end. And the idea is you hear it and then you talk about it and then you continue with the service because we break our services into two parts, which is the liturgy of the word and then the liturgy of the faithful. And that's, you're combining these things. The whole thing's worship. In our church, particularly, like everything is chanted or sung. So, except for when the homily's given, you just talk, obviously. So, it's interesting when you read this kind of, he's quoting. It's funny how much time, like Origen, Tertullian, and I'm trying to think who else is in here. Sometimes I think Clement. I don't think Clement's a saint of the church, of any church. Origen and Tertullian were not. They were ultimately died condemned as heretics, but they wrote a lot of really good stuff before all that happened. And so it's interesting that we see a lot of stuff coming from them. It's kind of weird in a way, but it makes some sense. But like their
Hmm.
records were really good. So I mean, there's a million other
Hmm.
things I could say, but like that was one of the things that I had to kind of get a kick out of when that very first line was saying the sermons were not the focus, not the focus. Just kind of funny the way.
Yeah, and then here's 10 pages on
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I also think like it's showing, I mean, it's also showing the development of like
Yep.
how did that transition change or how did that transition take place from a lesser important aspect or little attention to like how did that gain more attention? Um,
You s- you see, I mean, you see it grow over time, at least from what I can see. Like, it's interesting because they do talk. He acts as if there aren't many examples of sermons, but I know, I mean, I've got books of sermons by, now we're talking people like later, 300, 400, 500
right.
AD. But still to us, that's like still relatively early.
Sure.
But you have people like St. John Chrysostom, famous, like everybody should read his sermons. They are, I mean, he's broken down. I mean, he would in what is Istanbul today? Used to be Constantinople. Thank you. They might be giants. In the middle of that is a place that people think is a mosque, but is really a church, which is Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia was the great church, is massive, massive building.
Hmm.
And, you had preachers like, I'm pretty sure he served there, St. John Chrysostom. I think I'm trying to remember my history. Pretty sure he served there, but he would get in the middle of the church and he would preach from this raised platform, um, really eloquently. People would sit and listen to him preach for however long he went, probably, I would imagine, an hour. He would exposit on these things. They had nothing else to do. And for them to come and hear a really good oratory, especially as Christians and to hear, the scripture broken down. He would also, pointedly point at the what you call it, the emperor and his wife and say, you guys are doing wrong things. And of course that got him kicked out and he was exiled. But you have like preaching has its place. Some people would do
Sure.
more, some would do less, but it's hard to call it the focus. I'd put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I I noted was how involved, like, the choose my words carefully, how involved the regular body members were
Yeah.
in speaking and sharing.
Yeah.
And like at the bottom of 187, this may be the time when community members utter testimony and prophecies. Um, like there was just a lot of contrib like vocal contribution of people. And I mean, I'm assuming, I mean, so I mean, your regular body members sing, like my assumption is their vocal participation on Sunday morning
Yep.
and the other gatherings you have is music.
Yep. Yep.
And that's the same for me. That's not me.
Yeah.
That's the same for us. Like we've been going through Jude here. We're wrapping up Jude this month. And it's the warning against false teachers coming into the church. And one of the mindsets of that is, you have these itinerant traveling preachers who would just show up at church.
Yep.
And when we reading in the book of Acts, I can't remember which church it was, what city it was, but there's a scene where Paul and Barnabas show up at the synagogue, as a for instance, and they're like, "Hey, we're Jews, you're Jews, stand up, give us,"
Yep.
and then they preach Jesus. I thought of when Jesus was in his home synagogue, and it's like, "Hey, you're the hometown
Mhm.
boy. Read some
Speak.
scripture."
Speak.
And like, one of the things we talked about the other night in our small group was, I think, so I'll say early church, using, and I'm agreeing with your description of that. I think the early church at some point probably figured, hey, it might not be a good idea just to let, like, at a previous church, like we called that open mic, and I
Yeah.
hated it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, like it's probably at some point, like it probably stopped being a great idea to just pass that. They didn't have a mic, but to just pass the conch around
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
for a Lord of the there's a Lord of the
I like it.
Flies.
Hey, I like it.
At some point they probably stopped passing the conch, because some people had some, I would assume, some wacky things. So
Yeah.
I wonder, like, if that, and I know that when we say early, I understand timeline wise what we're reading about. It doesn't say this in here, and I'm just assuming, which could be wrong.
Hmm.
But I feel like that transition probably took place because, hey, we do have, and you'll like this. Um, I mean, that's when they started, they started developing creeds.
Mhm.
Um, Jude is referring to the teachings of the apostles. So at some point, those letters that are making the rounds between the cities and the churches
Yep.
are becoming canon.
Yep.
Blah, like all of that kind of stuff. So I mean, I would think at some point, as I'm going to use the word control, which may or may not be the right word, but at some point they're probably like, hey, we're not just going to pass the conch. Um, we need some clarity. We need some consistency in teaching. We need some orthodoxy in teaching. Um, and this person is probably the person to do that.
Yeah. 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 I mean, you think I was pulling up the D.K. We brought that up last time.
Yeah.
Even in there, they were dealing with that. I'm trying to think right here. It talks, there's a chapter 11 of that. So it's just paragraphs, but it says, I'm going to read it. It says, let every apostle that comes to you be received as the Lord, but he shall not
Mm-hmm.
remain except one day. But if there be need, also the next. But if he remains 3 days, he is a false prophet. And when the apostle goes away, let him take nothing but bread until he lodges. But if he asks money, he is a false prophet. So he had, I mean, it goes on to talk about this, but like trying to deal with, in the first century, like this is dated to the first century, typically maybe the second century, but already,
Mm-hmm.
it's only been decades, obviously, and clearly this was happening even at the time of St. Paul. You have rules and regulations being made concerning this very thing, the very problem, of dealing with people going
Mm-hmm.
around.
Mm-hmm.
And even for you all, I don't know how it works for your denomination. I know for us, obviously, we're ordained, uh, and people are given what we call a blessing to preach or teach, and they have to be vetted. They have to be capable. They have to have, it has to be determined if they've got that gift or not. Usually, like if I got, church school teachers in our church, it's up to me to say, okay, this person is, they're
Yeah.
skilled, but to preach in the church, usually it's something that at least in our experience, it's usually left. It's given to typically to the priest to do that. Although he can say with if he's blessed by the bishop to allow others to have some lay teacher teach or whatever, but they have to be capable. So yeah, I mean definitely. And for instance, like if you visited my church, I would not be permitted to allow you to preach. It's something that's very limited in scope about who can do this or who if someone decided just to speak up in the back of the church, we'd have to say kindly, we don't do this, So yeah, I think you've got
Yeah.
an evolution where, however it worked at the synagogues, clearly there was order, and the synagogue had a form of worship, undoubtedly, and probably different synagogues had different forms of how they would do things. There were, the temple had one way, boom, the synagogues probably had some variation, I would imagine, how they do things, depending on whoever was in charge of the synagogue. But in the churches, obviously, over time, that sort of thing narrowed down.
Yeah. And for us, I mean, we're independent.
Yeah,
So maybe in some ways people be like, so like part of that is, I guess one side of that spectrum is so we can do whatever we want to, but also like very quickly, like, I mean, sort of, but not really.
yeah,
Um, I think the truth of us being able to do whatever we want to is our polity is an elder led church.
right.
Um, and like we do, I mean, so then we do have freedom to to determine that, but it also is not a um yeah, it's not an anything goes. So for us, kind of the how about this? How about the speaking roles on a Sunday, um, or the speaking times on a Sunday? Um, there might be some sort of like during the music time, there might be some sort of encouragement, exhortation from the person
Mhm.
leading the singing. Um, we have we have like a kind of like a welcome, and this will be kind of like, I mean, this will probably be very much your past experience.
Yep.
We have like a welcome, and in that we talk about an opportunity to give, an opportunity for generosity. What we've been doing, kind of coming out of that, is someone um, will read the text, and more often than not, it's a portion of the text that whoever is preaching is going to be preaching on. Sometimes it's like not the text, but a similar text, and then there's the message. and that's typically myself or one of our other pastors. And then we have we for communion we have like a communion meditation, um, and then we've this month we've been when we've closed our gathering, we've been reading the doxology from Jude just because that's been our text.
Hmm.
And like none of those things are like it's not a free for all. I think we are, and this is where this is going to be. This will probably seem very subjective, um, and it is subjective. But we get to decide, like, okay, like who is going to do those things.
Right.
It's not a hey, I'd like to give like there's not a format where someone says, hey, I want to give an offering meditation or the welcome, and then like 3 days later they're doing that. Like
Yeah.
it's
Yep.
just not that. And honestly, it's people that we know and trust, people that we're in relationship with, and all of those like sometimes when we talk about things or when I talk about things that like let's say it's sermon prep and I talk about the reading and studying that I'm doing. I think sometimes we can be in this place where like I'm gonna get like someone is gonna Jesus juke me and be like, oh yeah, well what about prayer? What about the work of like all of that kind of stuff? And like for me, it's just kind of like let's just assume like I'm not talking about that. And even in that speaking thing, like I think there's a level of spiritual discernment that we have
Mhm.
because it's not open mic. It's not, we don't hand someone the conch and then they just get to go up there
Yeah.
and do their
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
Um, because it is like at some level, it is a teaching role.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, and we want to take our doctrine and
Yeah.
protect that seriously.
Yep.
Um, and we've had people who usually it's myself or one of our other pastors who teaches. Sometimes it's another person, but it's always someone that we're at least relatively familiar with
Hmm.
in those situations because we don't want someone just getting up there and going cuckoo crazy.
Yeah.
Um, because that's not going to be good for anybody.
No. I mean, there has to be accountability. That's the main thing. I think even with,
Right.
with our paradigm, I would say where we have a lot of freedom. I mean, I'm very comfortable. I mean, reading this and thinking about how he approaches or how he's trying to describe the worship that he sees in these older texts. It echoes a lot with what we do now, and you can see kind of where we've come from when I'm reading the look in the book. You know, where certainly Orthodox worships come from. There are constraints on us, but I'm grateful for those. You know, I'm grateful to have. I mean, honestly, I'm grateful to have a bishop who I can go to who has, I hope, you know, the pastoral charism, and
Mm-hmm.
I can ask questions. And honestly, and he knows this, and I know this. You know, he's got to take the weight, you know, of that. But I'm here to do his, you know, to work on his behalf. So there is that limitation, but I found that strange enough very liberating. You know,
Sure.
you've got boundaries, and they're boundaries that you can take your people to and go, well, this is here's the boundaries. You know, what you're asking is over the side of the boundary, so we can't go there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's not something I made up. It's something that it exists. It's been, you know, I mean, he really tries to not use the word tradition. He's desperately hard, just working so hard to not say tradition in here, and just keeps trying all these other words because everybody's so afraid of that word, and there's no reason to be afraid of that word because that's just something St. Paul talks about frequently. Paradosis, you know, to pass something down. Um, it's gonna evolve over time to some degree. The real question, and I think this is the real question in my mind when I read this is what, you know, I think you framed it in terms of prescriptive and descriptive too. Like what
Yeah.
how should that play out? I mean, that's my as an Orthodox Christian when I read this, like what is it just that all the stuff was quaint, everybody kind of picks what they do, or is there actually meat and bones to this thing that if you change the thing, you lose something? That's really the question. And I think, he doesn't really answer that question. He mostly is just trying to say, well, hey, look at what they did. They I tell you the one thing I keep taking issue with is he keeps talking about like this is Orthodox, so I get it if people don't get it. I'm trying to see if I can find it here. He talks about the Eucharistic meal. He keeps talking about it as a symbolic meal.
Mm,
I'm like, man, I mean, I guess if symbol means what it's supposed to mean, then I'll go there with him. But like the way he treats it, it's very like he treats it like it was a trade-off. Well, we could have this chaotic feast or we could have this symbolic meal. And
mm,
so they chose this sort of simplified meal of, bread, wine, and water, essentially. And I don't think he's getting that right, but I think he's working from the framework he's in.
mhm,
But it's interesting, just he doesn't. One thing he doesn't ever. I don't know why he doesn't address it. He talks about a lot of interesting stuff in here. So the Eucharist talked about kind of how the play of the service went, the division of the. He talked about the evening banquet and the morning banquet. Well, we have that Saturday. We have the Great Vespers on Saturday evenings, Sunday morning, and usually you can follow that with matins, which is a morning service done at night, or it can be done in the morning. And then you have the Divine Liturgy in the morning, where you have like all of this ties into it flows overnight into the morning into the communion service. Like everything's leading you to this point. And it's all, it's taking, a baseball hat, gilding it in gold, layering it with jewels, framing it in costly velvet, putting diamonds and rubies all over it. And so it stops being just sort of merely a cover and becomes like this amazingly beautiful thing that's supposed to communicate something. So you have this structure that's supposed to be doing something to those who are entering into it, participating in it, um, and reaping from it what it's supposed to give, which at the end is communion. So there's that. There's the divisions of this, the sermon, the kiss of peace. We still have that in our services.
mhm.
Actually, it's actually something that's many books have been written on it. Like, what do we do with
Sure.
like in the Orthodox circle? It's very strange. Uh, so it's interesting. I mean, the stuff's all here, but he never mentions making the sign of the cross, which
Mm,
is you know which was universal among Christians. I think well up. I mean, probably even up until pretty modern times when it sort of fell out of use by mostly I think in evangelical circles. But it's interesting; it's not in here, and he mentions stance and gesture in here somewhere,
mhm.
and
Yeah, that's after. I haven't got to that part.
yeah, yeah. So anyway, it's interesting what doesn't get mentioned, and I wonder why. I'm kind of wondering why. I wonder if he just wasn't aware of that.
Hmm.
I don't know how, but I
Hmm.
wrote a note to myself about that. But anyway, I'm kind of there's so much here that I'm just like, yeah, we do that, we do that, we do that. So I mean, that's
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was just gonna say one of the things that I thought was interesting was when he was early when he's describing the evening banquet before the morning service. This was on 189.
Yep.
Christians did not worry about that absence of the pagans from their services constituted a lost opportunity. Their
Yep.
worship was not evangelistic; it was not seeker sensitive. It was to glorify God rather than to attract outsiders. Um, yeah, I mean, I think I'm not sure that I have a comment. And I'm sure you have many thoughts.
Well,
I'm
I
not
mean,
sure.
it
I'm
does.
not really sure what my comment is besides, um, I mean, we do have people here on a Sunday morning who are not believers. And this is probably an early 2000s. This is probably an early 2000s uh, evangelical anxiety driven conversation about seeker sensitivity, which I think I'm kind of over. honestly. But like I do think, I mean, we do have non-believers in our gatherings on Sunday mornings. And I think there's a way to do things. Like I think you can take that into account without catering
Hmm.
or without or without watering down. Like I mean, I sure hope so. Like
Yeah.
I hope that someone would like I hope that someone like me would not just like get up there and throw out a whole bunch of kind of Christian jargon without taking into account the reality that there are non-believers here who like aren't going to understand those words.
Mm.
And they may not understand those words because they don't understand them. They may not understand those words because they grew up in a church where maybe those words were used and they weren't explained adequately. Um, so I don't know. I like that he wrote that. I mean, I get what he's saying, and I understand contextually. Um, but I also understand like my just our own reality. I don't know that I would kind of take issue with like I don't know that we're gearing what we're doing to attract outsiders. Now that doesn't mean that we're not doing that,
Sure. Sure.
but I don't like I have yet in my 8 years here, I have yet and maybe I'm just gonna ramble. So maybe these are my thoughts.
Hmm.
Like maybe our system is designed to inherently do that and I don't recognize it.
Hmm.
Maybe like we've never had a conversation that says, how are we going to attract outsiders? How can we be seeker sensitive? Maybe our system and our structure is inherently designed to do that without us knowing it. Like
Hmm.
I think that's a possibility.
Yeah.
I think that like maybe that's a humble way to look at it. Like I don't want to be naive and write off and say we're not seeker sensitive because we've never had a conversation about it. Like that would be probably pretty stupid and hubristic. Um, but I also don't feel like whether subtly or directly we're sitting around in a staff meeting or an elders meeting saying how can we be more seeker sensitive.
Yeah.
Like I'm just not sure that conversation is happening. It might be happening up here, but I just don't feel like that conversation is happening for us.
I mean, I think, it's interesting. I mean, I guess what interests me in this too is, especially when it comes to Orthodoxy, you've seen services before.
Yeah.
And I think one of the first things you said to me when you visited the seminary was, I realized it wasn't about me. And I think you
Mm-hmm.
might even say, particularly, I think when it comes to worship in the worshiping community of when you're worshiping Christ, the primary thing, is I personally think is the care of the community, that's there. Those who are there to worship the Lord and to learn and to partake of communion and to participate in the sacraments and life of the church is terminology we would use. That like there's the primary goal. And when other people want to do this, then it really is, I mean, really it's up to the Holy Spirit. Not that it isn't that we're not participating in that, but it's no one can, I mean, none of us convert other people, strictly speaking. It's the Holy Spirit working in their lives. So if they're there, they're ready to receive what's there. I mean, certainly our church, on the scale of American approaches to seeker sensitivity, is probably way down at the bottom. And yet
Mm-hmm.
we've
Mm-hmm.
got oodles of people coming in the door in different places. It's not, it doesn't
But
have to, and it's so other. What we do is so, it's not, that you come in and the service is going, you were kind of, you're not interrupting, but you're interjecting yourself in something that's already moving. Probably someone in a good Orthodox church, you'll have someone there who will come and say hi. Who are you and where are you from? Are you Orthodox? That's usually something we'll ask. No, I'm not. That's cool. Here's a bulletin or something. Well, we have people who like to do that, so they'll hand those out uh, and just what we'll usually tell a person when they come in is just watch. Just watch and see, and when you're done, talk to the priest, talk to people, stay around for some food, and just simply try to give the person a way to be in the presence of the worshiping community. In his book, he talks a bit about how those who were not a part of the community, they were shut out. They were closed. The door was closed at one time because there were so many misunderstandings about what was going on in the church. That's there's records of that going way back to the beginning. Um, which then again begs the question, what were they doing? And then what are we doing by comparison? And what's the difference? And is there something there that we ought to consider? Um, I think that, I think when I read this, I'm like, yeah, their intent in worshiping was to glorify God rather to attract outsiders. But I guess the point is too, though, people know when you're serious about what you're doing, and it will attract them. And you want people to come to church.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
want people to come, but we're not going to compromise our worship so that other people are going to feel better. We might try to make some things like remove barriers to entry. That's what I always talk about. That's a good communications
Yeah.
terminology. We might do that, Maybe in some Orthodox churches they do everything in Greek or church Slavonic. That's a problem in America. Maybe fix that. But yeah, I'm with you. Yeah. It it's it, I mean, worship is just something, it's broader, I think, than it's been limited. And of course, worship isn't
Yeah.
limited just to the services, but yeah. So yeah.
And I think in a similar way to what you just said. I mean, I'm not sure that we're necessarily interested. You said it directly, so I guess I can say it directly.
Mm.
Like we're not really interested in changing what we're doing either
Yep.
for the like that thing we've talked about it here, you and I have talked about it like that preferences, convictions, and essentials
Yep.
um thing. Like I'm not really interested in changing what we're doing either, just so more people would come here.
Hmm.
Because I mean, there are probably some things that we could do that more people would come here.
Yeah.
There are certainly some things that you guys could do that more people would come. And I just don't I mean I just don't think that's the I mean they're people, they're lost sheep. Um we want more people to come here so that people can hear the gospel.
Hmm.
We want people to come so that they can experience hope and freedom in Christ and all of those nice little Christian sayings. Like, I mean, we want those things,
Yeah, totally.
but also we're probably not going to cater to people's stuff.
Hmm.
We're not going to change. I mean, if anything, if we're going to change for something, it's going to be, man, the gospel tells us to do this, or the Bible tells us to do this, or something like that. But we're not gonna change for some other thing. Um, so in that way, I would say I don't know that we are seeker sensitive
Yeah.
because um, that's not what we're doing in that.
Well, it's funny, it's funny because I've mentioned a million times before, probably at least a couple on this podcast, but like Father Thomas Hopko was a priest who passed away 10 years ago this year, 10 years ago last week, and was a sort of a mentor to me from a distance, but people would say, we want people get this idea, we want people to be comfortable when they come to church, so we try to do
Yeah,
things to make them comfortable. Um, Sometimes physical things, soft, squishy chairs, which are
right,
nice,
right.
stuff like that. But he said, I would hope that no, in the broader sense, that no one is comfortable when they come to church, that there is a healthy discomfort that
Mm-hmm.
that coaxes and goads people towards repentance and towards Christ. And
Mm-hmm.
that's like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm very openly critical of the seeker sensitive movement. It doesn't produce good fruit. So like it's interesting when you see in it produces quick to typically quick to rot fruit. They just leave, But when you see
Mm-hmm.
something, especially when you look at what they're talking about here, what the author is trying to get at here, it's just a different focus altogether. It's not about even for us, it's tempting to think about numbers, oh, we've got so many new people coming to our church. That's great. It's wonderful to see, but it's not the numbers. Are we doing the things we're supposed to be doing as a worshiping in a sacramental community? That's how we would put
Mm-hmm.
it. If we're not doing
Mm-hmm.
that, it doesn't matter how many people are coming,
Right.
Be worse.
Right. Right.
I'm trying to find what he said at the end because I flipped ahead, but I couldn't find what I was looking for. He does spend a lot of time on the kiss of peace. It's very interesting. I thought that was interesting. It's a very That's an interesting discussion, right? Okay. Because here's something that it's easy to say it's prescribed in the New Testament. And there's a great
Mm-hmm.
point to it. Like he gets into this because I skipped ahead to that. In the Orthodox Church, like we kiss everything, people ask for a blessing. The priest makes the sign of the cross. They kiss his hand. It's kissing the hand of Christ. It's a blessing from Christ. Um, we have icons, of course. We kiss the icons. We have a cross. We kiss the cross. And then, usually when we greet each other, what we would say, people in America would say, oh, it's very European. But that's because Europe was primarily Christianized in this mindset and I don't
Right.
think I thought about it this way because he brings out the point of saying that the Romans would have looked at the Christians as weird for doing this. I thought, really interesting. But, it's very normal in our church um, to when people come to church, you'll see them. You might just hug them, but oftentimes, people will clasp each other by the hand, and usually it's very chaste, but it's like you kiss, kiss, kiss. It's like this very European. Priests always do it. I love that when I see another priest, I take him by the hand like this, and we exchange the kiss of peace, and then we kiss each other's the back. Like I'm holding his hand, I kiss his hand, and he kisses the back of my hand, and it's this really like powerful kind of manly, but yet very brotherly thing that kind of melts divisions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it is interesting that he sees the importance of like, if you're going to go to communion with each other, if you're going to say we are one, so how do we do that? Well, we have to at least be able to come up and be close enough to each other to exchange a chaste, godly, holy kiss that's one of peace. Because it's really hard. It's hard to do that when you're mad at, when you're holding anger and harboring anger in your heart towards someone.
Mm-hmm.
And it can
Mm-hmm.
actually heal that. So it is pretty important. And that was part of the preparation for communion. You
Yeah.
couldn't go to that until you'd done this.
Mm-hmm.
But in our churches, we don't do that. Well, some churches do it, but broadly, like during the service, the people don't generally do that in most churches. It's just too chaotic. But the priests, if there are two priests serving, they always will exchange the kiss of peace. It's very cool. It's very
So, so I want to wrap up this part of where we
Yeah,
are, and I think we can talk about that next time. But I think like when you said it's very chaotic, I'm wondering if, and I got to read the rest of the chapter,
sure.
so that's why we're gonna.
Right there.
I'm wondering if like that's where the evangelical, hey, take a minute and
Yeah,
like greet those around you,
yeah,
which which on like the, I mean, I know that there are still churches that do this, so I'm gonna be as gracious as I possibly can. We don't do
yeah,
that. But and I think one of the reasons that we don't do that is because like things that we've kind of like things that I've read, things that I've taken in, like people who are here you go, you're gonna love this. You can probably know where I'm going.
Maybe.
People who are visitors
Hmm. There's something to that.
don't like we're drawing attention to them,
Yep.
blah 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 blah.
Yep.
So
That would be a really tough one. I mean, even from an Orthodox perspective, certainly that would be a very tough one.
so maybe I mean maybe the fact that we don't do that is an attempt to be seeker sensitive because we don't want to make people feel uncomfortable.
Right.
Um, so I'll have to say, hey, this is two pastors talk, and we just spent a whole lot of time sort of talking about the sermon, but not really talking about the sermon. So I think we did that justice. Um, we are reading through slowly, patiently, impatiently, very slowly. This book together, The Patient Ferment of the Early Church by Alan Kreider. We're talking about what Kreider, that's
Right.
Jamie's line, talking about just some implications of what these things might mean for our own individual churches, what the implications might be for the church at large. Um, and we appreciate you spending time with us. We'd like it if you would like or subscribe to this channel. We release when we're in the flow. We release about every other week. Um, so thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Appreciate your time today. Hope you have a super rest of your day. If you have thoughts, questions, concerns, we'd love for you to post them in the bottom. Try to be sensitive to that and respond when we can. But this is Two Pastors Talk. Thanks for your time today.